The moment I held that cream-colored envelope in my hands, something told me it would cause trouble. Thick cardstock with gold embossing. My mother-in-law Margaret never did anything halfway. I sighed, running my thumb over the raised lettering of our names. Mr. and Mrs. James Wilson. Just us. No mention of our twins, Emma and Ethan. "What's that?" James asked, walking into the kitchen where I stood frozen by the counter. "Something from your mother," I replied, sliding my fingernail under the seal. Inside was an invitation to what Margaret called the vacation of a lifetime, a 2-week Mediterranean cruise to celebrate her 70th birthday. The itinerary listed stops in Italy, Greece, and Spain, with excursions to ancient ruins and private vineyard tours. It was the kind of trip most people only dream about. But as I scanned the details, my stomach twisted into knots. The invitation specified, "Adults only," in elegant script at the bottom, followed by a personal note. "Darlings, wouldn't it be wonderful to enjoy some grown-up time? I've already arranged for a lovely woman to watch the children." I handed the invitation to James, watching his expression closely as he read. The slight furrow of his brow told me everything I needed to know. He was conflicted but wouldn't immediately take my side. "She's excluded Emma and Ethan," I said, stating the obvious, "and apparently decided who should watch our children without consulting us." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You know how Mom is about these things. She probably thinks she's doing us a favor." "A favor?" I repeated, my voice sharper than intended. "Our children aren't inconveniences to be pawned off on strangers." "Diane's not a stranger. She's watched them before." "That's not the point, James. This wasn't the first time Margaret had drawn a line separating us from our children. Since the twins were born 5 years ago, she'd made countless comments about how they'd changed me, as if motherhood had somehow diminished who I was. Each family gathering became an exercise in restraint as she questioned my parenting decisions or suggested the children were the reason I hadn't advanced further in my career. "Let's sleep on it," James suggested, setting the invitation on the yai counter. "We don't need to decide tonight." But that night, as I lay awake listening to James's steady breathing beside me, I couldn't stop thinking about all the times Margaret had undermined me. There was the Christmas she gave the twins toys I had specifically said were inappropriate for their age. The time she scheduled a family portrait but told me the wrong time, so the photos ended up being just James, the twins, and her. The constant comments about how the children had my stubborn nature whenever they misbehaved. I slipped out of bed and went to check on the twins. Emma was sprawled across her bed, one arm flung dramatically over her head, while Ethan was curled around his favorite stuffed dinosaur. Looking at them, something hardened inside me. They deserved better than to be treated as afterthoughts by their grandmother. By morning, I'd made up my mind. This wasn't just about a vacation. It was about respect. For me, for our family, and for the boundaries I'd tried to establish for years. I waited until James left for work before calling Margaret directly. "Good morning, dear," she answered, her voice perfectly pleasant. "I assume you received my invitation?" "We did," I replied carefully. "It looks like an amazing trip." "Oh, it will be. I've been planning for months. The suite I've booked for you, and James has a private balcony overlooking the sea." I took a deep breath. "It sounds wonderful, Margaret, but I'm afraid we'll have to decline." There was a pause. "Decline? But why? I've arranged everything." "James and I don't feel comfortable leaving the children for that long." "Don't be ridiculous," she scoffed. "They're not infants anymore. Besides, I've already paid the deposits." Non-refundable deposits, I might add. The familiar weight of guilt began to settle on my shoulders, exactly as she intended. Margaret was a master at making people feel obligated to her. But this time, I refused to bend. "I'm sorry about the deposits," I said, surprised by how steady my voice remained. "But our decision is final." What happened next would set in motion a chain of events I couldn't have anticipated. Margaret's voice turned cold, and she said something that would finally give me the courage to stand up to her once and for all. This is why James should have married someone who understands family obligations. Someone who wouldn't turn my son against me using those children as pawns. In that moment, something inside me snapped. The conversation that followed would change everything, but not in the way either of us expected. Her words hung in the air between us, sharp and venomous. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. Using the children as pawns, I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. Is that really what you think of me, Margaret? Well, what else am I supposed to think? She replied. James never would have refused this trip before you and those children came along. He understands the importance of family traditions. The irony of her statement wasn't lost on me. Family traditions, but only the ones she approved of, only the family members she deemed worthy of inclusion. Our children are family, I said. And if you can't see that, then we have a much bigger problem than a missed vacation. I ended the call before she could respond, my hands trembling with anger and something else, a strange sense of liberation. For years, I'd swallowed my objections to keep the peace, convinced that confronting Margaret would only make things worse for James. Now I wondered if my silence had actually enabled her behavior. When James came home that evening, I was waiting, with a glass of wine and the truth. I spoke with your mother today, I began, watching his expression carefully. About the cruise invitation. He set down his briefcase, immediately wary. What happened? I told him everything. The conversation, her accusation, my response. With each word, I expected him to defend her as he always did, to tell me I was overreacting or misunderstanding her intentions. Instead, he listened quietly, the muscle in his jaw tightening. She really said that? He finally asked. About you. Using the kids as pawns? I nodded. Among other things, he sat heavily on the couch beside me, running a hand over his face. I'm sorry. I should have been the one to call her about the trip. That's not the point, James. This isn't about who made the call. It's about a pattern that's been going on, for years. I took a deep breath. She doesn't respect me as your wife or as the mother of your children. And frankly, I don't think she respects your choices either. His brow furrowed. What do you mean? Think about it. Every time she undermines my parenting, she's saying she doesn't trust your judgment in choosing me as your partner. Every time. She excludes Emma and Ethan. She's rejecting a part of you too. I could see the moment my words hit home, the realization dawning in his eyes. For the first time, he wasn't seeing this as a conflict between his mother and me, but as something that affected our entire family, him included. We talked late into the night, rehashing incidents I'd previously dismissed to keep the peace. How Margaret had forgotten to include photos of me in the family album she created last Christmas. The time she'd taken the twins shopping and returned them with matching outfits that I'd specifically said weren't practical. The constant comments about how James had settled down too soon before he could experience life. I thought if I just stayed positive and gave her time, she'd eventually accept me, I admitted. But it's been 7 years, James. 7 years of trying to win over someone who has no interest in being won over. He took my hand, squeezing it gently. What do you want to do? The question caught me off guard. In all our conversations about his mother, he'd never asked what I wanted. It had always been about finding compromises that would keep Margaret happy while minimizing my discomfort. I think we need some distance, I said carefully. Not forever, but long enough to establish that we're a package deal, all 4 of us. He nodded slowly. Okay, I'll talk to her tomorrow. But Margaret didn't wait for James to call. The next morning, my phone lit up with a text from her. I've been thinking about our conversation. Perhaps we should discuss this further over lunch? Just the two of us. I showed James the message, watching his reaction. She's trying to divide us, he observed, surprising me with his insight. Deal with you separately from me. What should I do? He took the phone from my hand and typed a response. Mom, we need to talk about this as a family. We can come over this weekend, all four of us. Her reply came almost instantly. There's no need to involve the children in adult matters. Besides, I've already made alternate arrangements for the cruise. James can still come if he wishes. I felt like I'd been slapped. After everything, she was still trying to separate us, to pull James away from his family. His face hardened as he read the message. Without a word, he pressed call and put the phone on speaker. Mom, he said when she answered, his voice firmer than I'd ever heard him speak to her. This isn't about the cruise anymore. This is about how you treat my wife and children. What happened next would change everything between us, and set in motion a plan that would give Margaret exactly the kind of lesson she needed. I don't know what's gotten into you, Margaret huffed through the speaker. Your wife clearly has you wrapped around her finger. I watched James's face transform as something inside him finally broke. The dutiful son who always made excuses for his mother disappeared, replaced by a man defending his family. Stop it, Mom. Just stop, he said, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. For years I've let you disrespect my wife, because I thought you just needed time to adjust. I've excused your behavior, made allowances when you excluded my children, and convinced myself you would eventually come around. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. That ends today, he continued. We are a family, me, my wife, and our children. If you can't respect that, then we need to reevaluate our relationship. James, you can't possibly mean, I do mean it. And for the record, I won't be joining you on the cruise either. Not without my wife and children. He ended the call before she could respond. When he looked at me, his eyes were filled with a mix of regret and resolve. I should have done that years ago, he said quietly. I wrapped my arms around him, feeling the tension in his shoulders. What now? Now, he said, pulling back to look at me. We take some time to figure out what kind of relationship we want with her moving forward, if any. Later that night, after the twins were asleep, we sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of wine between us discussing options. It was during this conversation that the idea first took shape. What if, I said, refilling our glasses, we took the kids on our own vacation? During the same time as her cruise? James raised an eyebrow. Where would we go? Somewhere amazing. Somewhere the kids would love. I pulled my laptop closer and began searching. Look at this. There's a family resort in Costa Rica with zip lines through the rainforest, wildlife tours, and beach activities for kids. As we explored options, a notification popped up on James's phone, an email from his mother. The subject line read, Cruise documents. She can't be serious, I muttered as he opened it. But she was. Margaret had attached all the booking information for the cruise, including a note. I'm still holding your reservation. Please reconsider. James shook his head in disbelief. She really doesn't get it, does she? That's when the plan fully crystallized in my mind. James, I said slowly, what if we use the money we would have spent on childcare during her cruise to take our own family vacation? And what if we happened to schedule it for the exact same time? A smile spread across his face. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? I'm suggesting we show your mother exactly what she'll be missing by excluding her grandchildren. And us, for that matter. The next day, I called my parents. Unlike Margaret, they had always embraced their role as grandparents, flying out for birthdays and school events despite living several states away. We need a favor, I explained, outlining our situation and the plan we were forming. My dad chuckled. Sounds like that woman needs a reality check. Count us in. With their financial help, an early inheritance, my father called it, we booked a luxury family vacation that paralleled Margaret's cruise in both timing and splendor. Where she would be touring Italian vineyards, we would be exploring volcanoes in Hawaii. While she dined at exclusive Mediterranean restaurants, we would be having beachside luau's with fire dancers that would thrill the twins. We decided not to tell Margaret about our plans yet. Instead, James carefully maintained the illusion that he was still considering her offer, even as we finalized our own arrangements. 3 weeks before the scheduled departure date, Margaret invited us to dinner, all 4 of us, which was unusual enough to raise my suspicions. "She's going to try to convince me to go without you," James predicted as we drove to her house. "But she's including the kids, so it seems like she's making an effort." The twins were excited to see their grandmother, despite everything. Emma had even drawn her a picture, which she clutched proudly in her small hand. Margaret's house was exactly what you'd expect, immaculately decorated with expensive furniture that seemed designed to make guests uncomfortable. She greeted us at the door with practiced warmth, bending to accept Emma's artwork with a thin smile. "How lovely, dear," she said, setting it aside without really looking at it. "I've made your favorite dinner, James, and there's ice cream for the children afterward." Throughout the meal, she focused her attention on James and occasionally the twins, directing questions about their school and activities in a way that seemed designed to demonstrate her grandmotherly interest. I was pointedly excluded from most of the conversation, but for once it didn't bother me. I knew what was coming. As predicted, after dinner, she suggested the children watch a movie in the other room so the adults could talk. Once they were settled, she turned to James with a practiced expression of concern. "I've been thinking about our disagreement," she began carefully. "And I realize I may have been too hasty in my reaction." James glanced at me, then back at his mother. "Go on." "The cruise is important to me. Having you there is important to me." She reached across the table to touch his hand. "I understand. Your wife doesn't want to leave the children, but that shouldn't prevent you from celebrating this milestone with your mother." I bit my tongue, waiting. This was James's moment. "Actually, Mom," he said, gently removing his hand from hers, "we've made other plans for those dates." Her smile faltered. "What kind of plans?" "Family plans," he replied simply. The glance she shot me was pure venom, but her voice remained controlled. "I see. And what exactly are these family plans that take precedence over my 70th birthday celebration?" The moment had arrived. It was time to reveal exactly what Margaret would be missing. "We're taking the children to Hawaii," I said, unable to keep the satisfaction from my voice. 2 weeks at the Grand Wailea Resort on Maui. Margaret's face went through a remarkable series of expressions: disbelief, anger, and finally, a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hawaii? That seems excessive for children who won't even remember it." "Oh, we'll make sure they remember," James chimed in, pulling out his phone. "Look at this. Private beachfront villa, personal chef for 3 meals a day, kids' adventure club with volcano tours and snorkeling lessons." He scrolled through photos of the luxurious accommodations we'd booked. Infinity pools overlooking the ocean, bedrooms larger than Margaret's entire living room, and pristine beaches just steps from our door. "The best part," I added, "is that my parents are joining us. They're thrilled to spend quality time with their grandchildren." The emphasis on grandchildren wasn't subtle, and Margaret didn't miss it. Her lips thinned to a barely visible line. "I see," she said icily. "And this just happens to be scheduled during my birthday cruise?" James met her gaze steadily. "We thought since you preferred an adults-only vacation, we'd plan something the whole family could enjoy together." "How thoughtful," Margaret replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "And how exactly are you affording this extravagance? I know your teacher's salary isn't funding beachfront villas, Sarah." The way she said teacher made my profession sound like something shameful. Before I could respond, James stepped in. Mom, that's completely inappropriate. I'm merely expressing concern for your financial well-being, she protested, the picture of wounded innocence. Hawaii is hardly a budget destination. My parents helped, I explained, keeping my tone even. They believe in creating memories with their grandchildren while they're still young enough to enjoy them. The implication struck home. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Then she played her final card. Well, I hope you won't regret this decision when it's too late, she said, turning to James. I'm not getting any younger. You know, this cruise might be our last opportunity to create some special memories together. The guilt tactic might have worked months ago, but James simply shook his head. We create memories as a family now, Mom. All four of us. The drive home was quiet, both of us processing what had happened. The twins fell asleep in their car seats, exhausted from the tension they'd sensed but couldn't understand. She'll retaliate, I finally said, breaking the silence. You know that, right? James nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Probably. But I'm done letting her manipulate us. Sure enough, Margaret's response came the very next day, not to us directly, but through James's sister Elaine, who called in a state of agitation. What did you do to Mom? She demanded when James answered. She's threatening to cancel the entire cruise and change her will. James put the call on speaker so I could hear. We declined her invitation because she excluded Sarah and the kids. That's all. That's not how she tells it, Elaine shot back. She says you're punishing her for wanting some adult time with her children on her milestone birthday. Did she mention that she suggested I go without my wife and kids? There was a pause on the other end. Well, she might have mentioned something about you having different priorities now. My priority is my family, Elaine. The whole family. Look, his sister sighed, her tone softening. I get it. Mom can be difficult. But she's devastated, James. She cried for hours last night. The guilt trip almost worked. I saw James waver, his resolve flickering for a moment. Then Emma wandered into the room, clutching her favorite stuffed unicorn, and his expression hardened again. Tell Mom the cruise offer still stands if she wants to include all of us, he said firmly. Otherwise, our plans are set. After he hung up, I pulled him into a hug. Are you okay? Better than okay, he replied, squeezing me tight. For the first time, I feel like I'm making the right choice. That evening, as we were bathing the twins, my phone buzzed with an unexpected notification. A friend request from Christopher Wilson, James's estranged father. My finger hovered over the screen in shock. Christopher had left when James was just 12, abandoning the family for a new life in Australia. James hadn't spoken to him in nearly 20 years. James, I called, my voice shaking slightly. You need to see this. He appeared in the bathroom doorway, sleeves rolled up. When I showed him the notification, his face drained of color. That's impossible, he whispered. He wouldn't, but before he could finish, a private message appeared below the friend request. Sarah, I understand we've never met, but I've been following James's life from afar. Margaret contacted me yesterday, quite upset. I think it's time I reached out. Would you and James be willing to speak with me? The bombshell had just detonated in our carefully constructed plans. Margaret hadn't just retaliated. She'd gone nuclear, reaching out to the man who had broken her heart and her family 2 decades ago. What do we do? I asked, watching James's shell-shocked expression. His response was unexpected. A slow smile spread across his face, followed by something I hadn't heard in weeks, laughter. She thinks this will make us cave, he said, shaking his head in disbelief. She has no idea what she's just put in motion. I stared at him, puzzled. What do you mean? My father left because of her, Sarah, not the other way around. And I think it's finally time everyone knew the truth. What are you talking about? I whispered, conscious of the twins splashing happily in the bathtub beside us. Your mother always said he abandoned you for another woman. James leaned against the doorframe, his expression distant as if seeing into the past. That's the story she wanted everyone to believe. I found out the truth when I was 17. He gestured toward the children. Let's get them to bed first. The next hour moved in slow motion as we dried the twins, read them bedtime stories, and tucked them in. All the while, my mind raced with questions. In 7 years of marriage, James had rarely spoken about his father, deflecting conversations with practiced ease whenever the topic arose. Finally, with 2 mugs of tea between us at the kitchen table, he pulled out an old metal box from the back of our closet, something I'd seen but never questioned. I've kept these all these years, he said, opening the lid to reveal a stack of yellowed envelopes. Letters my father sent me after he left. Letters my mother intercepted and hid. How did you find them? I was cleaning out the attic for a school project when I stumbled across them in an old suitcase. Mom was at work. It was the only reason I had the chance to read them without her knowledge. He pulled out one of the letters, the paper worn from repeated handling. He didn't leave us for another woman, Sarah. He left because staying had become impossible. According to the letters, Margaret's controlling behavior had gradually evolved into something more sinister over their 15-year marriage. She'd isolated Christopher from friends and family, monitored his communications, and created elaborate lies to maintain her image of the perfect family. When he'd finally gathered the courage to leave, she'd threatened to destroy his relationship with James unless he disappeared completely. The other woman story was her creation, James explained, his voice hollow. She told everyone he'd had an affair, even me. And because I never heard from him directly, I believed her. But these letters, she intercepted all of them. For 5 years, he wrote to me every month, sent them to our home address because he didn't know where else to reach me. And for 5 years, she hid them away. I felt sick. Why didn't you confront her when you found them? I tried. Once. A shadow crossed his face. She had a complete breakdown, threatened to hurt herself if I ever mentioned him again. I was 17, scared, and still dependent on her. So I buried the truth and tried to move on. And your father? You never reached out to him? James shook his head. By the time I found the letters, the return address was no longer valid. He'd moved, probably given up hope of ever hearing back from me. He picked up his phone, staring at the message from his father. Until now. The implications made my head spin. Margaret hadn't just been difficult or controlling. She'd systematically destroyed her husband's relationship with his son, maintained a web of lies for decades, and continued the same manipulative patterns with us. She's using him now, James continued, his voice strengthening with resolve. Reaching out to him because she thinks it will upset me enough to abandon our plans. But she doesn't realize she's just given me exactly what I've wanted for 20 years, a chance to reconnect with my father. I squeezed his hand. What do you want to do? I want to respond. And I want to meet him, all of us, as a family. His eyes met mine, seeking reassurance. Would that be okay with you? Of course, I said without hesitation. He's your father. He's our children's grandfather. That night, James crafted a careful response, explaining our situation with Margaret and expressing his desire to meet. The reply came within hours. Christopher was living in Sydney but would fly to meet us the following weekend if we were willing. There's something else, James said the next morning as we prepared breakfast for the twins. If my father is coming, here, we need to tell Margaret before she finds out some other way. The thought of confronting her with our knowledge made my stomach clench, but he was right. This wasn't just about our vacation anymore. It was about decades of manipulation and lies. We decided to meet her on neutral ground, a quiet cafe downtown where the twins could play in the adjoining children's area while we talked. James called to arrange it, giving no hint of what was to come. Margaret arrived precisely on time, dressed impeccably as always, her expression a careful mask of concern. "I was surprised to hear from you," she said, sliding into the booth across from us. "Have you reconsidered the cruise?" "No," James replied evenly. "We need to discuss something else, something important." I watched her face as James placed one of his father's letters on the table between them. For a split second, her mask slipped, revealing a flash of panic before she composed herself. "What's this?" she asked, though her voice betrayed that she already knew. "A letter from Dad, one of dozens you kept from me." Her eyes darted around the cafe as if searching for an escape route. "James, I don't think this is the appropriate place." Christopher reached out to me. He interrupted, his voice steady despite the emotion I could sense beneath it. "He's flying in this weekend to meet us, all of us, including his grandchildren." The color drained from Margaret's face. "You can't be serious. After everything he did—" "After everything you said he did," James corrected. "I know the truth. Mom? I've known since I was 17. What happened next shocked both of us. Instead of denying it or becoming defensive, Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You don't understand," she whispered, her carefully manicured hand trembling as she reached for her water glass. "I did what I had to do to protect us." "Protect us from what?" James demanded. Margaret looked directly at me for the first time since arriving. "From losing everything." As she began to speak, I realized we'd only scratched the surface of the Wilson family secrets. The truth that emerged would force us all to re-examine not just our planned revenge, but our entire understanding of the past 20 years. Margaret's hands twisted the napkin in her lap, her composure crumbling with each passing second. The polished veneer I'd grown accustomed to was gone, replaced by something I'd never seen before: raw vulnerability. "Your father's family was wealthy," she began, her voice barely audible above the cafe's ambient noise. "Old money from his grandfather's shipping business. When we married, they made it clear they disapproved of me, the daughter of immigrants who worked as a housekeeper." James leaned forward, skepticism written across his face. "Dad never mentioned family money." "Because they cut him off when he chose me," Margaret replied. "Christopher was idealistic back then, convinced love would conquer all. We struggled financially for years, but he never complained." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "Then his father died, and everything changed. Suddenly, the family wanted to reconcile, but only with Christopher and you, not me." "What are you talking about?" James asked. "His mother, your grandmother Eleanor, offered him a deal. She would restore his inheritance and set up a trust fund for you, but only if he divorced me." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "She called me a gold digger, said I'd trapped him. Christopher refused initially, but then—" "Then what?" I prompted, when she trailed off. "Then the recession hit. We were on the verge of losing everything: our house, your college fund. Christopher began reconsidering his mother's offer." Her voice hardened. "He actually suggested we divorce on paper but continue our relationship secretly, just to secure your future." James shook his head in disbelief. "That doesn't match what his letters said." "Of course it doesn't," Margaret snapped, a flash of her usual sharpness returning. "He wouldn't admit to you that he was willing to publicly discard your mother for money." I studied her face, searching for signs of deception but found none. Either she believed what she was saying, or she was an exceptional liar. "So you're claiming Dad left because of his family's ultimatum, not because of you?" James clarified. "No, he left because I refused to go along with his plan. I told him I wouldn't be his dirty secret, hidden away from his family like something shameful." Her shoulders slumped. "When I threatened to fight for full custody, he chose to leave entirely. The other woman's story was easier to tell you than the truth, that your father had put a price tag on our marriage. James sat silent, processing this alternate version of his past. I reached for his hand under the table, feeling it tremble, slightly in mine. "Why keep his letters from me?" he finally asked. Margaret's expression darkened. "Because they were full of promises he never intended to keep. He wrote about coming back once he'd figured things out, about how much he missed you. But years passed, and he never returned, never fought for you. I was protecting you from false hope." "That wasn't your decision to make," James said quietly. "Perhaps not," she conceded. "But I'd already lost my husband. I couldn't bear to watch you wait by the mailbox for letters that would eventually stop coming." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Emma's laughter drifted over from the play area, a jarring contrast to the heavy atmosphere surrounding us. "Why are you telling us this now?" I asked. "Because Christopher Wilson walking back into our lives isn't the heartwarming reunion you're imagining," Margaret replied, her eyes meeting mine directly. "Ask yourself why, after 20 years of silence, he's suddenly interested in meeting his grandchildren. His mother died 6 months ago. I saw the obituary online. I'd bet anything he's inherited a fortune, and now he's trying to ease his conscience." The implication hung in the air between us. Was Christopher's timing purely coincidental, or was there truth to Margaret's suspicions? James pushed back from the table abruptly. "I need some air." Without waiting for a response, he strode toward the cafe exit. Margaret watched him go, then turned back to me. "I know you think I'm manipulative and controlling. Maybe I am. But everything I've done, everything, was to protect my family. For the first time, I considered the possibility that Margaret's narrative contained elements of truth. Not complete truth, perhaps, but enough to complicate the black and white picture we'd constructed. "I should check on James," I said, gathering my purse. "Sarah," Margaret called as I stood to leave. "Whatever you decide about meeting Christopher, promise me you'll be careful. Not for my sake, but for those children." I nodded curtly, then collected the twins from the play area and found James outside, pacing the sidewalk with his phone in hand. "He sent a flight confirmation," he said without preamble. "Arrives Friday afternoon." "Are we still meeting him?" I asked carefully. James ran a hand through his hair, his expression conflicted. "I don't know what to believe anymore. Mom's story. It answers questions I've had for years. But it doesn't explain why he kept writing for so long if he never intended to return." He pocketed his phone. "I need to hear his side before I make any judgments." That evening, after putting the twins to bed, we sat on the back porch with glasses of wine, watching fireflies blink in the gathering darkness. "What if they're both telling partial truths?" I suggested. "What if there's no villain in this story? Just people making flawed decisions in difficult circumstances?" James considered this. "Then meeting my father isn't about revenge against my mother anymore." "No," I agreed. "It's about filling in the missing pieces of your past." "And our trip to Hawaii?" I smiled slightly. "That can still be about showing your mother what she's missing by excluding the children." His laugh was genuine, if a bit strained. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." The next morning brought an unexpected development. A courier delivered a thick manila envelope addressed to James. Inside was a file containing financial statements, legal documents, and photographs, all meticulously organized with post-it notes in Margaret's handwriting. "She's building her case," I remarked, watching James spread the contents across our dining table. He nodded, lifting a faded photograph showing a much younger Margaret holding infant James, standing beside a stone-faced elderly couple who were clearly making no effort to hide their disdain. "These are my paternal grandparents," he said quietly. "I have no memory of ever meeting them." As we examined the documents further, a disturbing pattern emerged. Bank statements showed large withdrawals from Christopher's accounts to offshore holdings in the months before he left. Legal correspondence referenced trust modifications that excluded Margaret entirely. "This doesn't look good for your father," I admitted. James's jaw tightened. "Or it's an elaborate fabrication. We won't know until we hear his side." The doorbell rang, interrupting our investigation. James answered while I gathered the documents, listening as his voice shifted from polite greeting to surprise. "Sarah," he called, "you need to see this." I walked into the living room to find James holding an enormous gift basket overflowing with tropical-themed items: sunscreen, beach toys, children's snorkel sets, and Hawaiian shirts sized perfectly for the twins. The card attached read simply, "For my grandchildren. Looking forward to meeting you all." Christopher, James, and I exchanged glances. The gesture seemed innocent enough on the surface, but in light of Margaret's warnings, I couldn't help wondering. Was this genuine goodwill, or the opening move in a different kind of manipulation? "Friday," James said firmly. "We'll get answers. On Friday." But Friday would bring revelations neither of us was prepared for, and a decision that would forever alter the course of our family's future. Friday arrived with an unusual heaviness in the air, both literal and metaphorical. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, mirroring the tension that had built in our home over the past days. I'd taken the day off from teaching, unwilling to leave. James alone for this momentous meeting. We'd decided to host Christopher at our house rather than a public place. The twins, oblivious to the significance of the visitor, were excited about meeting a new grandfather who had sent them colorful beach toys. "What do we tell them?" I asked James as we prepared lunch. "About why they've never met him before." "The simplest version of the truth," he replied. "That he's been living far away for a long time." At precisely 2:00, the doorbell rang. James froze, knife suspended over the sandwich he was preparing. Our eyes met across the kitchen island, and I saw a flicker of something I'd never witnessed in my husband before: pure, unfiltered fear. "I'll get it," I said softly. The man standing on our porch bore an uncanny resemblance to James, the same strong jaw, the same crease between his eyebrows when he frowned. His hair had gone. Silver and deep lines marked the corners of his eyes, but there was no mistaking the relationship. "Sarah?" he said, his voice carrying a slight Australian accent. "I'm Christopher. Thank you for agreeing to this." I shook his outstretched hand, noting the expensive watch on his wrist and the tailored cut of his casual clothes. "Please, come." In. James had moved to the living room, standing rigid with his hands in his pockets. The moment Christopher stepped through the doorway, time seemed to suspend itself. Father and son, separated by decades of absence and misunderstanding, sizing each other up with identical expressions of cautious hope. "James," Christopher said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "you look exactly like my father." Something in James's posture shifted at these words. "Mom always said I took after her side of the family." A shadow crossed Christopher's face. "There are many things your mother might have said that weren't entirely accurate." Before James could respond, the twins came barreling down the hallway, stopping short when they spotted the stranger. "Are you our other grandpa?" Emma asked boldly, while Ethan partially hid behind her. Christopher knelt to their eye level, his expression softening. "I am, and you must be Emma and Ethan. I brought you something from Australia. Would you like to see?" The ice broken by the children's natural curiosity, we moved to the living room where Christopher distributed small gifts: a stuffed koala for Emma, a boomerang for Ethan, and a bottle of expensive Australian wine for James and me, as the twins played with their new treasures. The adults engaged in careful small talk. Christopher spoke about his life in Sydney, his work in international finance, his recent retirement. He asked thoughtful questions about the children, about my teaching career, about James's work in architectural design. Not once did he mention Margaret or the past, waiting for James to broach the subject first. After lunch, I took the twins to the backyard to play, giving father and son the privacy they needed. Through the kitchen window, I watched their animated conversation, James gesturing emphatically while Christopher listened, his expression grave. At one point, James pulled out the box of letters, spreading them across the coffee table between them. When I returned inside an hour later, the atmosphere had changed. James's earlier tension had dissipated, replaced by a pensive calm. Christopher's eyes were red-rimmed, as if he'd been fighting tears. "Sarah," James said, "Christopher has suggested we join him for dinner tonight, just the adults, to continue our conversation." I raised an eyebrow. "What about the twins?" "I've arranged for a babysitter from the service we used last month," Christopher interjected smoothly. If that's acceptable, of course. The ease with which he'd inserted himself into our family decisions set off alarm bells in my mind. "That's very presumptuous," I replied carefully. Christopher had the grace to look chagrined. "You're right. I apologize. I'm perhaps too accustomed to making arrangements without consulting others. Please, disregard the suggestion if it makes you uncomfortable." James caught my eye, his expression pleading. "I'd like to go, Sarah. There's more we need to discuss." How could I refuse him this chance for closure? "I'll call my sister to watch the kids," I conceded. Christopher insisted on sending his car service to collect us that evening, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows and a uniformed driver. He'd made reservations at La Maison, the most exclusive restaurant in town, where waiting lists typically stretched months long. "Your father appears to have connections," I murmured to James as we were escorted to a private dining room. "And money," he replied under his breath. "Lots of it." Christopher was already waiting, rising to greet us with flutes of champagne ready on the table. "Thank you for coming," he said, guiding me to my seat with practiced charm. Once we'd ordered, he folded his hands on the tablecloth and addressed us directly. "I know you've heard Margaret's version of what happened," he began. "Now I'd like to tell you mine, if you're willing to listen." James nodded, his expression guarded. "Much of what Margaret told you holds elements of truth," Christopher acknowledged. "My family did disapprove of our marriage. They did cut me off financially. But their reconciliation offer came much earlier than she suggested, when you were just a toddler, not when you were approaching college age." He pulled out his phone, navigating to a photo which he passed to James. "This was taken at your third birthday party. The only one my mother ever attended." James studied the image, his brow furrowed. "I don't remember this." "You wouldn't." "It ended in disaster when Margaret overheard my mother offering to establish a trust fund for you." Christopher's eyes darkened with the memory. "Your mother interpreted it as an attempt to control us, to buy her compliance." "Perhaps it was. So why did you leave?" I asked directly. Christopher's gaze shifted to me. "Because Margaret gave me an ultimatum. Cut all ties with my family, or she would divorce me and fight for sole custody. In those days, courts almost always favored mothers. I would have been reduced to weekend visitations, if that." "You could have fought harder," James said quietly. "Stayed for me." Pain flashed across Christopher's features. "Yes, I could have. Should have. It's the greatest regret of my life that I didn't." "And the money?" I pressed, remembering the financial documents Margaret had provided. "The large withdrawals before you left?" Christopher nodded, unsurprised by the question. "I see Margaret kept meticulous records. Those transfers were to establish your trust fund, James, against Margaret's wishes, but with the help of my family's lawyers. It was placed in a blind trust that would mature when you turned 25. James's head snapped up. "What trust? Fund? I never received anything." The expression that crossed Christopher's face was one of genuine shock. "That's impossible. The trust was irrevocable. Even I couldn't touch it once established." Well, I never saw a penny, James stated flatly. Christopher pulled out his phone again, typing rapidly. My lawyer will have the documentation. If the money wasn't distributed to you, we need to find out what happened. The conversation paused as our meals arrived, the silence heavy with implications. If Christopher was telling the truth, where had the trust fund gone? And if he was lying, what was his real purpose in reconnecting now? Over dessert, Christopher turned the conversation toward our upcoming Hawaii vacation. It sounds wonderful, he said. The perfect family getaway. We're looking forward to it, I replied, suddenly reluctant to share details. I was thinking, he continued, swirling the last of his wine. Perhaps I could join you for part of the trip. Not the entire 2 weeks, of course, but a few days to get to know my grandchildren better. James stiffened beside me. That's not possible. The trip is fully planned. I wouldn't impose, Christopher assured us quickly. I'd stay at a separate resort, arrange my own activities, just overlap for occasional meals or outings. The request seemed reasonable on the surface, but something about it troubled me deeply. We'd only just met this man, and already he was inserting himself into our family vacation. The same vacation we'd planned partly to spite Margaret for excluding our children. James caught my expression and cleared his throat. We'll have to think about it. This is all happening very quickly. Christopher nodded, though disappointment flickered across his face. Of course. Take all the time you need. As we drove home, rain pelting against the windows of the sedan, James and I sat in contemplative silence. It was only when we pulled into our driveway that he finally spoke. I believe him, he said simply. About the trust fund, about Mom's ultimatum. It explains so much about how she's always behaved. The control, the isolation, the fear of losing me to anyone else. I chose my words carefully. I think there's truth in what he's saying. But James, something still doesn't add up. Why now, after all these years? He looked at me, his expression troubled. What if we've got this all wrong? What if we're punishing my mother for things that were never entirely her fault? The question hung between us as we entered our quiet home, paid my sister for babysitting, and checked on our sleeping children. It wasn't until we were lying in bed, both wide awake despite the late hour, that James voiced the thought that had been plaguing me since dinner. What would you think about canceling Hawaii? Joining Mom's cruise instead? My immediate instinct was to object, after everything we'd been through, after all our planning and Margaret's behavior. But looking at James's conflicted expression, I realized the situation had evolved beyond a simple power struggle with his mother. Let's sleep on it, I suggested, echoing his words from weeks earlier when the invitation first arrived. But as I drifted toward sleep, my phone buzzed with an incoming email. The subject line jolted me fully awake. Urgent. What Christopher Wilson isn't telling you. The sender's address was unfamiliar, but the message would upend everything we thought we knew about both Margaret and Christopher, and force us to make a decision that would alter our family forever. My finger hovered over the email, sleep forgotten as adrenaline coursed through me. The sender's address, pdavidsonhartleylaw.com, meant nothing to me, but the timestamp showed it had been sent just 20 minutes ago, well past midnight. James, I whispered, nudging him awake. You need to see this. He blinked groggily, then sat upright when I showed him the subject line. Together, we opened the message. Mrs. Wilson. We haven't met, but I served as Eleanor Wilson's personal attorney for the past 30 years until her death 6 months ago. I've recently become aware that Christopher Wilson has made contact with your family. While I'm limited in what I can legally disclose, professional ethics compel me to warn you that his intentions may not be as benevolent as they appear. The trust fund he mentioned to your husband was indeed established, and was emptied 3 years ago through a series of complex legal maneuvers that, while technically legal, violated the spirit of the arrangement. I've attached documentation. That may prove illuminating. Should you wish to discuss this matter further, please contact me at your earliest convenience. My involvement must remain confidential for now. Respectfully, Patricia Davidson. The attachment contained bank statements, legal correspondence, and court filings. Dozens of pages documenting how Christopher had systematically drained the trust fund he'd established for James, funneling the money through shell companies before finally absorbing it into his personal accounts 3 years ago. "This can't be right," James whispered, scrolling through the evidence with trembling hands. He seemed so sincere. "People who manipulate for a living usually do," I replied, a chill running through me as I recalled Christopher's smooth charm, his perfectly calibrated gestures of generosity. James ran a hand through his hair. "But why go to all this trouble now? If he already took the money, why reappear in our lives?" I studied the documents more closely, searching for answers. On the final page, a note from Patricia Davidson provided the missing piece. "Eleanor Wilson's will contained a condition that Christopher has kept hidden from you. To receive his substantial inheritance, he must demonstrate reconciliation with his son. Documentation of meaningful family connection must be submitted to the trustees by June 30th, with specific provisions regarding meeting his grandchildren." June 30th, I repeated. "That's 2 weeks from now. And our Hawaii trip?" "Starts next week." James's expression darkened. "The vacation he's so eager to join. The perfect photo opportunity to prove he's reconnected with his family," I added, the pieces falling into place. "He doesn't want a relationship. He wants pictures to show the trustees." Sleep was impossible after that revelation. We spent the rest of the night combing through Patricia Davidson's evidence, comparing it with Margaret's documents and Christopher's claims. By dawn, we'd assembled a disturbing picture. Christopher had not only abandoned his family and stolen James's trust fund, but was now attempting to manipulate us for financial gain. "I need to call my mother," James said, as the first light of morning filtered through our bedroom blinds. Despite the early hour, Margaret answered on the second ring. "James, is everything all right?" "Did you know?" he asked without preamble. "About the trust fund Christopher set up for me? About him draining it 3 years ago?" Her sharp intake of breath was answer enough. "How did you find out?" His mother's attorney reached out to us. A long pause followed. "I knew about the trust fund. It's partly why I kept his letters from you. He used it as a bargaining chip, promising you'd have financial security if you maintained contact. But I didn't know he'd taken the money. I swear. It, James? Why didn't you tell me about the fund when I got older?" "Because I was ashamed," she admitted, her voice small. "I'd kept you from your father based partly on principle, refusing his money when it could have made your life easier. By the time you were in college, struggling with student loans, the thought of telling you there had been a trust fund waiting, I couldn't bear it. For once, I believed Margaret completely. Her flaws had always included pride and controlling behavior, but never greed. He wants to join us in Hawaii, James told her. Now we know why. What will you do?" she asked. James looked at me, a spark of determination in his eyes. Something unexpected. After hanging up, he outlined a plan so audacious I couldn't help but laugh. "You realize this means completely changing our vacation plans?" "Not completely," he corrected. "Just adding an element of surprise." We spent the morning making calls to the resort in Hawaii, to my parents, to James's sister Elaine, and finally to Christopher himself, inviting him to dinner that evening to discuss the vacation arrangements. He arrived precisely on time, bearing an expensive bottle of scotch and beaming with satisfaction at what he clearly perceived as a victory. "I'm delighted you're considering my suggestion," he said, settling into our living room with practiced ease. "I've already looked into booking a suite at your resort." "Actually," James replied, his tone deliberately casual, "we've been thinking it might be nice to have everyone together for this trip." Christopher's smile faltered slightly. Everyone? Family reunion of sorts, I elaborated. My parents will be there, and we've invited James's sister and her family. We thought you might like to join too. How thoughtful, he managed, though his enthusiasm had noticeably dimmed. Though I wonder if that might be overwhelming for the children, having so many people competing for their attention. Oh, they'll love it, James assured him. And there's one more person we'd like to include. He paused deliberately. My mother. The color drained from Christopher's face. Margaret? Surely you can't be serious. Dead serious, James confirmed. In fact, we've already spoken with her about it this morning. And she agreed? Christopher asked incredulously. Not only agreed, I said, but she's looking forward to it. Family healing and all that. Christopher set down his untouched drink, clearly recalculating his strategy. While I appreciate the sentiment, I'm not sure that's wise. Margaret and our history is complicated. So we've heard, James replied dryly. From both sides now. A flicker of something, suspicion perhaps, crossed Christopher's face. Both sides? Mom shared her perspective years ago. You gave yours yesterday. And this morning, we heard from a third party altogether. James reached for the folder containing Patricia Davidson's documents. Someone who seems to have a much clearer understanding of your true motives. The mask of fatherly concern dropped completely as Christopher registered what James was holding. Whatever that woman has told you is thoroughly documented, I interjected. Your mother's will conditions, the drained trust fund, your sudden interest in meeting your grandchildren 2 weeks before the trustee's deadline. Did you really think we wouldn't figure it out? Christopher's expression hardened, all pretense abandoned. You have no idea what I've been through these past decades. No, we don't, James agreed. Just as you have no idea what it was like growing up believing my father left because he didn't want me. That was your mother's doing, not mine. You could have fought harder, could have found a way to stay in my life without my mother's permission. James's voice remained steady despite the emotion behind his words. Instead, you chose the path of least resistance. And when you needed money, you stole what was rightfully mine. Christopher stood abruptly. I don't have to listen to this. The trust was legally mine to manage. Then you won't mind explaining that to the trustees examining your mother's will conditions, I suggested. I'm sure Ms. Davidson would be happy to provide her documentation. For a moment, Christopher seemed ready to storm out. Then calculation returned to his eyes. What do you want from me? James smiled thinly. Nothing. Not a relationship, not explanations, and certainly not your presence on our family vacation. But, I added, we are still going to Hawaii next week, and we're still inviting Margaret to join us. Christopher's laugh was bitter. So this was all her manipulation, turning you against me to secure her own invitation? No, James replied firmly. This was us discovering the truth about both our parents and making our own decision. Margaret has caused her share of pain in this family. But unlike you, she's always been present. Always put me first, even when her methods were misguided. And now, I continued, we're giving her the chance to be present for her grandchildren too, something she should have done from the beginning. Christopher gathered his coat, all charm evaporated. You're making a mistake. Margaret will never change her controlling ways. Perhaps not, James acknowledged, but she's shown she's willing to try. That's more than we can say for you. After he left, we sat in silence, processing the confrontation. Finally, James spoke. Did we just invite my mother on our revenge vacation? I couldn't help laughing at the absurdity. We did. Think she'll actually come? Only one way to find out, he replied, reaching for his phone. Margaret's reaction to Our invitation was everything we hadn't expected. Speechless shock followed by genuine tears. "I don't deserve this kindness," she said once she'd composed herself. "Probably not," James agreed bluntly. "But our children deserve to know their grandmother, the real version, not the controlling one who excludes them from important family events." "I want to be better," she whispered. "I've wanted that for a long time but didn't know how to start." "This is how," I told her. "By joining us instead of trying to divide us." As we finalized the new arrangements for our trip, Margaret in a separate villa at the same resort, my parents still joining as planned, I reflected on how thoroughly our revenge plot had transformed. What began as a petty act of retaliation had evolved into something unexpected, a genuine attempt at family healing. Yet even as we moved forward with these new plans, I couldn't shake a lingering sense of unease. Christopher had accepted his dismissal too easily. A man willing to manipulate his family for financial gain wouldn't simply walk away when millions were at stake. The night before our departure, that foreboding materialized in the form of an email from the resort in Hawaii, confirming a reservation for Christopher Wilson. Not in our resort, but in the one directly adjacent, with clear views of the beach where our children would be playing. "He's not giving up," I told James, showing him the confirmation. His expression hardened. "Then neither are we." Hawaii greeted us with fragrant plumeria leis and tropical breezes that instantly melted the tension from our shoulders. The twins squealed with delight as we entered our beachfront villa, racing from room to room with unbridled excitement. "It's like a castle, Mommy," Emma declared, bouncing on the king-sized bed. Watching their joy, I almost forgot the complications that had preceded our arrival. Almost. James stood on the lanai, gazing toward the neighboring resort where Christopher had booked his stay. "He's out there somewhere," he murmured when I joined him. "Let him watch from a distance," I replied, slipping my hand into his. "We're not giving him the satisfaction of disrupting this trip." Margaret arrived that evening, checking into her separate villa with uncharacteristic humility. She'd brought modest gifts for the twins, sand toys and sun hats, not the extravagant presents that typically marked her attempts to win favor. "Thank you for including me," she said quietly as we settled on the restaurant terrace for dinner, the ocean waves providing a soothing soundtrack. "I know this wasn't the original plan." "No," James agreed, "but sometimes plans change for the better." The first few days unfolded with surprising ease. Margaret maintained respectful boundaries, never criticizing my parenting or attempting to monopolize the children. When my parents arrived on day 3, she greeted them with genuine warmth, even laughing at my father's terrible jokes. "Your mother seems different," my mom observed as we watched Margaret helping the twins build an elaborate sandcastle. "More relaxed." "Turns out all she needed was to be included rather than feared," I replied, still marveling at the transformation. Chatiwe. Our fourth morning, the inevitable happened. As we gathered for breakfast on the beachside terrace, I spotted Christopher at a nearby table, pretending to read a newspaper while clearly monitoring our family gathering. 12 o'clock, I muttered to James. "Don't turn suddenly." James casually glanced in the indicated direction, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "How long has he been there?" "Just arrived. He hasn't seen us notice him yet." Margaret followed, our gaze stiffening when she recognized her ex-husband. "He always was persistent," she said tightly. Before we could decide how to respond, Emma solved the problem for us. Spotting the man she'd met at our house, she waved enthusiastically. "Look, Daddy, it's Australia Grandpa!" Christopher, caught in his surveillance, had no choice but to acknowledge the greeting. With practiced charm, he approached our table. "What a delightful coincidence," he exclaimed. "I had no idea you'd be at this resort." "Different resort, same beach," James corrected coolly. "And not a coincidence at all, as you well know." An uncomfortable silence descended until Margaret unexpectedly broke it. "Hello, Christopher. You're looking well." The surprise on his face was almost comical. After 20 years of separation, these were her first words to him. Casual, as if they'd parted ways last week. "Margaret," he managed, clearly thrown off balance. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Family vacation," she replied simply. "The whole family." The emphasis wasn't lost on him. His gaze moved from Margaret to my parents, from the twins to James and me. A complete family unit with no missing pieces requiring his presence. "Would you like to join us for breakfast?" I offered, shocking everyone at the table. When James shot me a questioning glance, I gave him a slight nod. I had my reasons. Christopher hesitated, clearly suspicious of the unexpected invitation, but ultimately sat in the empty chair between my father and Margaret, about as far from the twins as possible. What followed was the most surreal meal of my life. My father, oblivious to the undercurrents, engaged Christopher in conversation about Australian wildlife. The twins peppered him with questions about kangaroos. Margaret maintained a polite but distant demeanor, neither hostile nor friendly. Throughout the meal, I observed Christopher carefully. Despite his smooth responses and practiced charm, his attention repeatedly drifted to his watch, checking the time with increasing frequency as breakfast progressed. When he excused himself to take a call, I followed discreetly, positioning myself near enough to overhear his conversation without being obvious. "Yes, I'm with them now," he said tersely into his phone. "The whole family, including Margaret. No, I don't have the photos yet. These things take time if they're to appear natural. Just stall them until Wednesday. I'll have what I need by then." So that was it. He needed photographic evidence of family reconciliation to secure his inheritance, with a deadline just 2 days away. I returned to the table before Christopher, sharing what I'd overheard with James and Margaret in hurried whispers. To my surprise, Margaret showed no anger at this confirmation of his manipulation, only a deep sadness. "He hasn't changed at all," she said quietly, still looking for the quickest path to what he wants, regardless of who gets hurt. When Christopher returned, we were ready. James suggested a family beach photo to commemorate the coincidence of Christopher's appearance. Eyes lighting with barely concealed triumph, Christopher readily agreed. As my father arranged us on the shoreline, positioning Christopher strategically between James and the twins, I mentally counted down to the moment our plan would unfold. "Everyone say inheritance," James called instead of the expected cheese. The confusion on Christopher's face was priceless as the implications registered. Before he could respond, James continued, loud enough for nearby beachgoers to hear. "Let's make sure we get a good one for those trustees reviewing grandmother's will conditions. Wednesday's deadline is approaching fast." The color drained from Christopher's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do," I replied calmly. "We all do. Your mother's will requires proof of reconciliation with your family, specifically your grandchildren, by Wednesday. That's why you're so eager for these photos." "Patricia Davidson provided quite thorough documentation," Margaret added, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "Including the fact that you emptied our son's trust fund 3 years ago." Christopher's mask of affability crumbled completely. "This is absurd. I don't have to listen to these accusations." "Then, leave," James suggested. "But understand this. We've already contacted the trustees with evidence of your manipulation. There will be no inheritance, Christopher. Not through us." For a moment, raw fury contorted his features. Then, with visible effort, he composed himself. "You have no idea what you've done," he said coldly, before turning and walking away. We watched in silence as he disappeared down the beach, the magnitude of the confrontation settling over us. "Well," my father said into the awkward silence, "I think I missed something important there." Despite the tension of the morning, the remainder of that day unfolded with unexpected lightness. Free from Christopher's machinations, we embraced our vacation with renewed enthusiasm. Margaret, particularly, seemed transformed, laughing freely as she helped the twins navigate their first snorkeling experience, genuinely engaging with my parents over dinner. That evening, as the children roasted marshmallows with their grandparents, at the beach bonfire, James and I walked along the moonlit shore. "Do you think we've seen the last of him?" I asked. "Probably not," James admitted. "Men like that don't accept defeat easily." "Are you okay with all of this?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the distant figures of his mother and my parents with our children. I spent 20 years believing a carefully constructed story about my father. Now I know he was never the man I thought I'd lost, and my mother, for all her flaws, was protecting me in the only way she knew how. She made mistakes, I acknowledged. Serious ones, he agreed. But seeing her with the twins these past few days, I think she's finally understood what she almost lost by trying to control everything. When we returned to the bonfire, Margaret was helping Ethan perfect his marshmallow roasting technique, her designer outfit spotted with sticky residue, completely unconcerned with the mess. It was a version of her I'd never seen before, present, engaged, gloriously imperfect. Later that night, after the twins were asleep, a hotel envelope arrived at our villa. Inside was a handwritten note from Margaret. James and Sarah. There are not enough words to express my gratitude for this second chance. Seeing our family together, truly together, has shown me everything I've been doing wrong all these years. I've spent a lifetime trying to protect what I love by controlling it, only to nearly destroy it instead. Christopher's reappearance forced me to confront painful truths, but it also gave me the opportunity to finally make things right. Tomorrow, I'd like to share something with both of you, something I should have revealed years ago. It may help explain, though not excuse, many of my actions. With love and apologies, Mom. James and I exchanged glances, both intrigued and apprehensive about what revelation might await us. After everything we'd learned about Christopher's deception, what secrets could Margaret still be harboring? The answer would come the following morning, a final piece of the puzzle that would completely reshape our understanding of the past 20 years and, ultimately, the future of our family. Morning arrived with gentle island sunshine filtering through the bamboo blinds of our villa. The twins were uncharacteristically sleeping in, exhausted from yesterday's adventures. James and I sat on the lanai with coffee, both equally anxious about Margaret's promised revelation. "What do you think it could be?" I asked, watching a pair of colorful birds flit between nearby palm trees. James shook his head. "After everything we've learned these past weeks, I'm not sure I can even guess." A soft knock interrupted our speculation. Margaret stood at the open doorway, already dressed despite the early hour. She carried a slender leather portfolio that she clutched like a shield. "May I join you?" she asked, her voice lacking its usual confidence. We welcomed her onto the lanai, and I poured her coffee while an uncomfortable silence settled around us. Finally, she opened the portfolio and removed several yellowed documents. "Before I explain these," she began, "I want to be clear that nothing I'm about to share excuses my behavior toward you, Sarah, or the children. But it might help you understand why I've been so—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Controlling?" James supplied. She nodded. "Controlling, fearful, desperate to maintain certain appearances." She handed James the first document, a medical report dated 3 years before his birth. He scanned it, his brow furrowing in confusion, then shock. "You had cancer?" he asked, looking up at his mother with new eyes. "Ovarian cancer, stage 3, she confirmed. "The doctors said I would never conceive naturally. That's why your birth was considered something of a miracle." She passed another document to James. This is the agreement Christopher and I signed with the fertility clinic. As James read, his face paled. Am I understanding this correctly? Margaret nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Christopher's mother, Eleanor, had connections to experimental fertility treatments not widely available in the United States. She arranged everything, paid for everything, but with conditions. What conditions? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect where this was going. That any child conceived would be raised with Wilson family values, that Eleanor would have significant influence in educational and religious decisions, and, most importantly, Margaret's voice broke slightly, that if Christopher and I ever divorced, custody would default to him. The implications hit me like a physical blow. So, when Christopher left, he could have taken James from me completely, Margaret finished. The agreement would have held up in court. Eleanor made sure of that. Her lawyers created it specifically to bypass normal custody arrangements. James sat frozen, processing this revelation. So when Dad left, he was giving up his right to custody? He was protecting me from his mother's influence? Yes and no, Margaret replied, her honesty refreshing after weeks of half-truths. Christopher did leave without exercising his custody rights, which was the one truly selfless thing he did. But he used that decision to negotiate the trust fund and other financial arrangements. He essentially sold his parental rights back to me. And the letters? James asked. Why hide those? Margaret looked down, shame evident in her posture. Because some of them mentioned the agreement. I was terrified you'd learn the truth and resent me for bringing you into such a complicated situation. Or worse, that you'd seek out Eleanor, who would poison you against me using the legal leverage she still maintained until you turned 18. So, every time Eleanor tried to forge a relationship with James, I began. I panicked, Margaret admitted. I saw it as the first step toward her taking him away. That fear drove everything. My overprotectiveness, my control issues, my opposition to any Wilson family contact. She pulled out one final document, a letter dated shortly after James's 18th birthday. This arrived from Eleanor's attorneys. She was finally acknowledging she had no more legal claim over you, but her parting shot was this threat, that someday Christopher would return and reveal everything, and you would choose him over me. James. Read the letter, his expression shifting from shock to anger to something like understanding. So, when Christopher suddenly appeared after all these years, I thought Eleanor's prediction was finally coming true, Margaret finished. That's why I contacted him first, trying to warn him away. Instead, I inadvertently revealed to him that you had children, information he needed for his inheritance claim. The pieces clicked into place. Margaret's desperate need for control, her fear of losing James, her resistance to outside influences on her grandchildren. None of it excused her behavior, but it cast it in an entirely new light. Why tell us now? I asked gently. Because yesterday, watching Christopher try to manipulate you for money, I realized I've been doing the same thing in my own way. Manipulating through guilt and control rather than charm and lies, but manipulation nonetheless. She looked directly at me. You were right to stand up to me about the cruise, Sarah. Right to create boundaries I should have respected from the beginning, she turned to James. And you deserved parents who could put your needs above their own. Fears and desires. Christopher failed at that. So did I, in different ways. James sat silent for a long moment, then reached across the table to take his mother's hand. Thank you for telling me the truth. Finally. The sound of little feet interrupted, the emotional moment as the twins burst onto the lanai, bubbling with excitement about the day's planned activities. Grandma, you promised to help us find sea turtles, Emma reminded Margaret. The transformation on Margaret's face was immediate, the weight of decades lifting as she smiled at her granddaughter. I did promise that, didn't I? Let's have breakfast. First, then we'll go on our turtle hunt. As Margaret led the children inside to help with breakfast, James and I remained on the lanai, processing everything we'd learned. "Are you okay?" I asked, watching his pensive expression. "I think I am," he said slowly. "For the first time, I feel like I understand my entire life, not just fragments distorted by other people's agendas." Later that morning, as we walked along the beach watching Margaret patiently showing the twins how to spot turtle tracks in the sand, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought us here. What had begun as a petty act of revenge against an overbearing mother-in-law had evolved into something far more profound, a family healing decades in the making. "Look!" Ethan shouted suddenly, pointing toward the water where a green sea turtle was emerging from the waves. "Grandma was right," Margaret's expression of pure joy as she knelt beside her grandchildren, teaching them to maintain a respectful distance while observing the magnificent creature, told me everything I needed to know about the future. The controlling, perfectionist woman who had excluded my children from her cruise had been replaced by someone new, or perhaps someone who had been there all along, buried beneath layers of fear and insecurity. That evening, as we gathered for dinner at the beachside restaurant, Margaret, my parents, James, the twins, and me, we toasted to new beginnings. "To family," James said, raising his glass. "The one we choose to build, not the one defined by the past." Margaret's eyes met mine. Across the table, "Thank you," she mouthed silently. I nodded, acknowledging not just her gratitude but my own growth through this experience. I had started out determined to punish my mother-in-law for excluding my children, but ended up expanding our family circle instead. The luxury vacation I had planned as an act of revenge had transformed into something far more valuable, a journey toward understanding and forgiveness. The morning we were scheduled to leave Hawaii, a final surprise awaited us. A messenger delivered an envelope addressed to both James and Margaret. Inside was a legal notification that Christopher had been denied his inheritance based on evidence of manipulation, along with a second document that left us all speechless. Eleanor Wilson's attorneys had determined that the remaining estate should be divided between her grandson James and her former daughter-in-law Margaret, with trusts established for Emma and Ethan's education. "I don't understand," Margaret whispered, staring at the document in disbelief. "Eleanor hated me." "Maybe," James said thoughtfully, "but she respected you for putting me first all those years. Something Christopher never did. What will you do with the money?" I asked them both. Margaret and James exchanged a look of perfect understanding. "Set up a family foundation," they said simultaneously. "For children of complex custody arrangements," Margaret added. "And mothers who need support," James finished. As our plane took off that afternoon, the islands shrinking beneath us, I thought about the strange circle our journey had taken. The vacation that began as Margaret's adults-only cruise, the catalyst, for all that followed, had evolved into something far more significant than any of us could have imagined. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, noticing my reflective smile. "That sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all," I replied, watching the twins sleeping peacefully across the aisle, their grandmother gently adjusting their blankets. "Sometimes it's having the courage to break the cycle." The luxury vacation I had planned to punish Margaret had instead given her the greatest gift, the chance to become the grandmother she was meant to be. And in the process, it had given all of us something even more valuable, not just a family vacation, but a family made whole. As we soared above the clouds toward home, I found myself already planning our next trip, this time with Margaret's input from the very beginning. After all, some traditions were worth keeping, especially the new ones we were creating together.